Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the show today. We have our good friend Nick Redfern coming on, and we're going to be talking about secret histories, conspiracies, and aliens among us. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, energy healings, and psychic readings. So if there's stuff going on in your life, give me a call, send me an email, and we can set up a time for a private consultation. It's also brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com, where you can jumpstart your intuition today by downloading their free 50-page guide. Hang on one second. I just want to verify before I open my big mouth. Okay. And just for those people that have been watching my little video things, they're the ones that I have for sale on Amazon, like Icon, Deconstructing the Archetypes and the Ancients. But I've also released a new one that you can watch on my soulhealer.com website. It's under the article/video magazine tab, and it's called Evidence of Alien Intervention in Antiquity. I'll say it again, Evidence of Alien Intervention in Antiquity, soulhealer.com under the articles tab. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit about Nick, and we will get him on the air. Nick Redfern is the author of 30 books, but it's probably 45 now since this bio, on UFOs, Bigfoots, lake monsters, the abominable snowman, Hollywood scandals, including Monster Files, Monster Diaries, Memoirs of a Monster Hunter, Celebrity Secrets, There's Something in the Woods, Contact E, Final Events, The Real Men in Black, The NASA Conspiracies, Science Fiction Secrets, On the Trail of Saucers, Spies, Strange Secrets, and with our good friend Ken Gearhart, Monsters of Texas. He's appeared on more than 70 TV shows, and his webpage is nickredfernfortean.blogspot.com. The author of, we're going to talk about 2 books tonight, Bloodline of the Gods, which sounds really good, and then, of course, Secret Histories, Conspiracies, from Ancient Aliens to the New World Order. So please welcome Nick Redfern. Hey, Nick, how's it going?
Hey, Rita. I'm good, thanks. How are things with you?
Everything's going great here.
Good.
So
good.
We're going to be talking about these 2 books, but from what I understand, you've also just released 2 other new books.
Yeah, there's one called Chupacabra Road Trip, which is one of my big interests, cryptozoology, the study of unknown animals, and that one's just come out. And I also got a new book out on the Men in Black, which is my 3rd book on the Men in Black, and it's got the stunningly original title of Men in Black.
Men in Black 3.
Men in Black 3, it should be titled, yeah, I guess. But But it's just coincidence more than anything else that those 2 books and Bloodline of the Gods have come out within like a month of each other, because they're actually all with different publishers. But I guess eventually, the time is going to come when, just purely through coincidence, instead of the books being staggered across the years as they usually are, that all three publishers are going to sort of put them out at the same time. Obviously they don't get together and say, hey, when are you putting that one out, when we should put ours out? It doesn't work like that. So, it's that's why all three of them have come out together, not because I've been sort of feverishly writing all three at once. So.
Well, but you always are feverishly writing, or else you wouldn't have three to come out at the same time. But it's kind of like when publishers collide.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because, the Chupacabra book, although that's only just come out this month, the writing was actually finished in November of last year. But the Men in Black book, the writing was only finished about 5 weeks ago. But in other words, the publishers of the Chupacabra book, they usually have like a long lead-in after, when they're happy with the Word document, they put it to one side, and it might be 9 or 10 months before they decide to publish it. The company that published the Men in Black book, they like to get them out quickly. So in other words, they're both out at the same time, but one was finished nearly a year ago, and the other one was finished, like I said, about 4 or 5 weeks ago.
Wow, that's fast.
Yeah, well, the technology today, they just and get them out quickly. Turn it from the Word document to the formatted thing, and it's done basically.
Yeah, it's not like you're sending them a box with typed papers that they have to type, print and stuff.
No, they just convert the Word document into like a PDF, and the format and the file and the fonts and everything else, the layouts, and get the covers done, and which is good. I like that fact. It's much better than the old days. When you got to print books off and mail them off and get them insured in case the manuscript goes missing in the mail or whatever, gets damaged. And so in that sense, it's much more speedy. The technology is faster, and anybody can write a book nowadays. That's one of the good things. You can, when you got things like Kindle, CreateSpace, everything else, anybody can put something out. So.
Well, we know that. We just like good people to put stuff out.
Well, I sometimes find that, I submit a lot of ideas to authors and, to publishers. And, I quite often get ideas turned down, but not because they don't necessarily like them, but because they feel it's not going to sell many copies because it might be an obscure story. But that's why, I think the technology today and the do-it-yourself angle is good because, I've got plans to do exactly that, publish some books, just, self-publish them, and they may only sell a couple of hundred copies, but that's fine, because if I sell it to a couple of hundred people who are really interested in it, I'd rather do that than have a big publisher say, no, we don't want it, and then I just shelve the idea, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I'd sooner get it out for the the people who do want to read it. It doesn't bother me if it's 50 people or 500 or 5,000. I'll still put the book out. So.
Well, I was going to say all 4 of my books were self-published, and then one got picked up by a regular publisher. Yeah. And I like the self-publishing better. Yeah. Okay, now they have editors that find your spelling mistakes. That's a nice thing. But the turnaround was just so slow. It was so slow. And then you start forgetting what you wrote, and you moved on to the next thing, and it's like, that.
Well, I do know some authors, and they're like, oh, well, I'm an author. They kind of like get above themselves, think there's something special about them because they've written a book. Well, the way I look at it is that, not only can anybody write a book, well, I always say everybody's got at least one book inside them, an interesting story to tell. And I think that's the great thing about publishing today. In the past it was, you've got to be like a recognized author to write a book, or you're not really an author, which, to me is just garbage, I think self-publishing is a really good thing because you can be in control of the cover design. There's nobody editing out chunks of material. You can put it out in your own time frame. You can give it whatever title you want to give it. You know, I mean, a lot of people don't realize often the stuff that goes on behind, where the publisher may say, well, we don't like the title of the book, and according to the terms of the contract, we can actually decide on the title of the book. And we don't like 4 of the 20 photographs you sent us, so we're not putting those in. You know, all of that stuff, when you're self-published, you know, it becomes irrelevant because you're doing it all yourself. Now, I don't mind sort of, you know, having a good sort of stand-up argument with them about, hey, you know, I want those pictures leaving in. And usually, you know, they'll bend and I'll get what I want. But, I mean, when it's self-publishing, that never even becomes an issue. You're totally in control of every aspect of the production and the layout, the design, everything.
And so for everyone thinking about self-publishing, you do have to worry about things like copyright, you know, like for pictures and things like that. I mean, I think that's been my biggest issue is the editing. But, you know, you can find people that will edit it. I mean, I've had people design the covers for me. You know, you just have to be willing to lay out a little money to have it be a professional job. And that's really the biggest thing is, you know, are you just going to put something out, or do you want it to be professional and have people take it serious?
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's levels of, you know, what's sort of acceptable and what isn't. I mean, I've seen some really bad ones, mainly because, you know, people aren't sure of the technology involved. And I've seen some, particularly with Kindle, I've seen some really bad books where, you know, the photographs end up jumbled because they haven't sort of properly, you know, followed the guidelines on formatting and layout and the technology and everything else. And, you know, they don't look professionally made at all. But, I mean, you know, when you get to grips with it, and like as you say, if you've got an editor, if you feel you need an editor and you've got someone to do a cover, you know, that's even better still. I mean, and it's like with photographs. I always try and use my own pictures, you know, because it's just much easier to use your own pictures. You don't have to chase down who actually owns the picture. And if I don't have those, you know, I try and find old out-of-copyright pictures to use, you know, because you don't want to risk, you know, breaking somebody's or affecting somebody's copyright or violating the copyright. And then, of course, when it's in a published book, it's too late then. But so that's why I always try and use my own pictures and tell people to do the same. You know, if you're writing about something, get as many relevant pictures yourself, then you don't even have to give it a second thought then.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So let's kind of shift out of shop mode and talk a little bit about your Bloodline of the Gods book. I mean, we've talked about UFOs and potential ET contact in the past, but this book seems different, where you're delving into potential interaction of aliens and genetic manipulation, and I'm going to say in the past. So what's going on?
Well, yeah, the book itself, it's called Bloodline of the Gods, and it's about like a 250-page book, of which about 50 actually deals with the ancient astronaut scenario. The rest is sort of today's world and, you know, the last couple of centuries and so. But it deals with primarily people who have what's called Rh negative blood. And this is an area that was briefly mentioned in a couple of articles, actually about 40 years ago. But then it kind of died away and then went under the radar and was never really touched upon to any significant degree at all since then. But in the last couple of years, more and more people have come forward who are Rh negative and who've had sort of profound contactee and abduction type stories or experiences, or they feel drawn to the UFO subject. And as I said, there seems to be a deep tie-in where there's far more percentage-wise of people reporting these encounters who are Rh negative than aren't Rh negative. And of course, the big question some people may want answering, you know, is what is Rh negative blood? Who are the Rh negative?
That was my question.
Well, the way it works is like this, that the overwhelming vast majority of everybody on the planet is Rh positive. And what that means, the Rh comes from the rhesus monkey, and it's called the rhesus factor that we have in our blood. It's essentially what's called an antigen or a protein in the blood. And it basically means that, I mean, the rhesus monkey is, in terms of DNA, we're 92% identical with the rhesus monkey, our DNA and their DNA. It's just that small percentage of 8% that makes us obviously look and act different to the rhesus monkey. But 92% we're identical. Now, that sort of creates this ancient lineage going backwards to like early primitive proto-humans, when they were more sort of ape-like and 3 feet tall, and just the very earliest humans coming out of Africa. And we have this lineage with the rhesus monkey going back and back. Now, a small percentage of the human population completely lacks the rhesus factor. In other words, they don't have the DNA connection to the ancient rhesus monkey that everybody else does. Now, to give you sort of an idea of the figures, in the United States, the approximate number of people who are Rh negative and who are Caucasians is round about 9 to 13%. For African Americans, it's about 8 or 9%, and for Asian Americans, it's actually really low, like 1 to 2%. But if the theory of evolution is completely correct, the big question is, well, we're all Homo sapiens, so why is it that a small percentage of us actually don't have the connection to the rhesus factor and the connection, to the same lineage that the rest of us do? It's not like we're talking about there's different types of humans on the planet. Like in the distant past, you had Cro-Magnon man and Neanderthal man. Today, we're all Homo sapien. So why is it a small percentage of us lack that same factor, that same lineage?
And it can't be like a recessive type thing, like blue eyes or, other genetic characteristics where it has to be recessive in both parents and then it turns up in the kid?
No, it's not recessive or anything like that. But, there are people have theorized on the issue of things like sort of spontaneous mutations and things like this. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. And I mean, I would have actually no problem with, suggesting that there was a down-to-earth theory for this. We may not have fully understood it yet, but I would be happy to accept that it was just due to, the mysteries of nature and evolution, except for one thing. And that one thing is that when we look at people in the UFO field, and we're now studying this issue more and more, we're actually seeing the sheer number of people in the UFO field, even like writers and authors, abductees, contactees, who are all Rh negative. And they feel drawn to the UFO subject. And we can look back into old cases and find some interesting parallels there, which we can talk about. So in other words, there seems to be a UFO component to this, which takes it outside of just the idea of some sort of random weird mutation, amongst every so many people.
But that's really interesting. And, you were talking about the demographics, and it seems like, so it goes back really far, but it seems like the demographics are kind of spread over race, culture, geography around the globe versus kind of isolated to one culture.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, I mentioned how the figures are very low, but there's one group of people on the planet where their figures are roughly, again, depending on which sort of government or medical statistic you read or accept, the figures are roughly between 45 to 60% of the entire particular group of people are Rh negative. And those people are the Basque people of Spain and parts of France, which is BASQUE. Now, the Basque people, they look slightly different to the rest of us. They have sort of more prominent foreheads and noses. They look more bulky in the sense, but muscular. And their language is completely unique on the entire planet. Now, I'm originally from England, and you can find some English words, in the French language and the German language, where, the word, it's a similar word, not quite the same, but in the different languages. However, with the Basque people, their language is 100% unique. There's absolutely nothing like it anywhere else in the world in terms of their words and sentence structure and everything else. On top of that, the area where the Basque people live today, and, as I said, they've got up to like 60% Rh negatives, is where Cro-Magnon man lived 35 to 40,000 years ago, and they actually do have some characteristic physical traits similar to the Cro-Magnons. And other parts of the world where we know the Cro-Magnons proliferated, that they have slightly higher than normal Rh negatives, but not as much as the Basques in Spain. And this has given rise, even within scientific circles, to the probability that Cro-Magnon man was Rh negative, and the people who live in those areas today have inherited the blood as Cro-Magnon man got absorbed into Homo sapiens. But the genetic line has continued that Rh negative lineage. So that begs the question: why is it that Cro-Magnon man was different from the other early humans? And that sort of gets to the heart of the issue of, did ancient astronauts genetically manipulate an early primitive human that ultimately became Cro-Magnon?
But that's a really interesting question. When did Cro-Magnon walk the Earth?
Well, the figures are kind of a little bit controversial, because we're always finding little bits of data and bones and fossils that push it back a little bit further. But the general consensus is that it used to be that we could take Cro-Magnon back to about 35,000 years. Now it's about 45 to 48 based on more recent discoveries. So, maybe we can take it back further, but so far it's sort of in the mid-40s as far as when it sort of really began to develop and, take on its own identity, and this is actually the same time when the Neanderthals were around, but they were, very different type of human. I mean, we kind of think today, if we think about this, it would be kind of weird for us if we actually shared the planet with people who weren't Homo sapien. They were a different type of human. It would probably freak a lot of people out, but that's how it was back then. There were not competing tribes or cultures, but different types of human beings. Like Neanderthal, was a different human to the Cro-Magnon. So, a lot of weird angles with the development of the human race and different types, and Neanderthal man kind of died out under circumstances which a lot of people view as mysteriously, as, kind of. But Cro-Magnon man, I think a lot of people, they think of cavemen, that's a sort of typical phraseology that people use, dressed in bear skins with his club in the one hand, and dragging his wife by the hair back to the cave in the other, That's the image that a lot of people have. But Cro-Magnon man was actually highly evolved. Their brains were actually bigger than our brains, probably to the size of, if you got like a coffee mug, you look at the circle, the opening on the coffee mug, the circumference, that much bigger than ours. They were extremely skilled artists. If you look at some of the cave paintings in France, I mean, they easily rival anything you would see in like an art gallery today or a museum. They had an understanding of death and all its implications, and they had burial rites. We know from some of the ancient artifacts that have been found that they even had musical instruments, early string instruments. So, they weren't sort of savage cavemen just throwing spears at mammoths and, and then clubbing them over the head and sitting in the cave. They're actually highly evolved. And, of course, the big question is, how did they become so highly evolved so quickly?
We have a question from Neutron. I'm just going to read it. Anyway, it says, was Cro-Magnon man from the Canaanite side of Homo sapiens with RH, or were they before such a primordial man?
Well, that's a good question, because, as I said, it is difficult to know exactly when Cro-Magnon man first surfaced. Now, of course, it wouldn't have surfaced with the click of a finger, obviously, like overnight. But the earliest, as I said, the earliest remains we have is about 45,000 years ago. But clearly, it must have been on sort of the road to that path, thousands of years before. It's not going to be a spontaneous change in one particular species. But, we're not talking about Cro-Magnon man developing in the time period, for example, of ancient religious texts, like the Bible or the Mahabharata or, the Quran or whatever. We're talking about literally tens and tens and tens of thousands of years ago. So in other words, nothing in relation to Cro-Magnon man relates to anything in recorded history. This is essentially discovered history, which is sort of very different. So it's pretty much totally apart from, anything as far as we understand civilization, at least.
Where did they find, or where did Cro-Magnon man originate? Was he another out of Africa species, or do we just see him popping up in Europe?
Well, the best consensus on the part of people who sort of really understand this is that the very earliest humans, and by humans I don't mean that looks like us, I'm talking about sort of 2.5 to 3 feet tall, ape-like animals with vague human qualities that over time, started to use rocks and stones and spears and, very rudimentary language. But they were sort of the very earliest humans. We're talking millions of years ago, probably came out of Africa. And the prevailing theory is that over time they sort of spread across Europe and, through the land masses, etc., and then sort of spreading one way towards Europe, in another way towards India and Asia and so forth, and upwards towards what, Russia and what used to be the Soviet Union. And then, of course, when you have periodic ice ages and, the land becomes covered by ice, it would have allowed them to travel potentially in areas that previously were cut off, by oceans or channels, etc. And so, in other words, the originators, if you like, of the Neanderthals, the Cro-Magnons, you name it, the consensus is that they all sort of had their kickstart out of Africa.
Okay. Well, and the reason I'm asking about the Cro-Magnon in particular is it seems, because we were talking about the Basques, and how there is this concentration of the Basques, which I have another question about them. But it seems like they would maybe leave a trail of Rh negative people behind them, kind of?
Well, they do in the sense that, as I mentioned, there's the Basque people, where the Cro-Magnons lived in the distant past is where the Basque people live today. And as I said, their Rh negative figures are between 45 to 60%, whereas everywhere else in the world, for the most part, is like 8 to 9%. And also a lot of the Celtic people are Rh negative. Finland has a higher than normal Rh negative count as well. So, we find this in the Gaelic races, and of course, some of the Gaelic races are amongst some of the oldest European races. So the chances are, in the very distant past, their originators would have mingled with Cro-Magnon as well. So in other words, the older the race, not in every case, but in the older the race where the Cro-Magnons lived, we are seeing higher levels, suggesting, they were absorbed into what is today Homo sapien. And, again, all this sort of suggests, it doesn't prove anything, but it suggests that the Cro-Magnons were Rh negative because of, the connection with the areas today where they lived. But again, it sort of begs the question, why, did they develop in a fashion, or did they develop, or were they altered to, to essentially become something else rather than take a natural course?
And it sounds like the Basque people were really isolated, or chose to isolate themselves from the other populations around them to keep that community so tight?
Well, yeah, that's the interesting thing. Not only did they did sort of keep them. Well, they still do actually keep themselves to themselves. They see them as sort of their own distinct group of people, which in many respects they are. But I mean, the interesting thing is, Europe itself. I mean, it's a big area, but it's not. It's not gigantic. It's not like it's taking up half the planet. And so even though, you have all these countries next to each other, France, Holland, Germany, Belgium, etc., it's difficult to actually be isolated because you're so close to, another country. But the Basque people actually have successfully pretty much ensured that they remain the Basque people rather than, sort of becoming multicultural, so to speak. I mean, there is multicultural aspects, but certainly, not as much as you see elsewhere in Europe, where there's, people from all over the place. I mean, it's like in the UK, where I'm originally from. When I moved over here, I was sort of looking at all the paperwork and the statistics and realised, how many American people now live in, in the same way I live in the UK, how many people have left the US to live in the UK. And it's like tens and tens of thousands, and so it's interesting, we have this multicultural issue, but with the Basque people, even today, they're very much, their own people.
But we see that in a lot of cultures where, Jews are, they try to marry within their own religious tradition. I mean, and that was very common a long time ago, where people tried to marry within their own culture, within their own social strata, that we definitely do not see anymore.
No, you're right. And I think, things have become more relaxed in certainly the last couple of decades. And I think a lot of it was down to, that the stronger the religious belief, the less tendency there was to marry outside of your own particular religion. You find that a lot. And often, it's been a cause of strife and wars over the years. But, yeah, we're definitely seeing a change in things now, becoming more multicultural. And, of course, we're seeing, some of the problem issues with all the refugees, how that, impacts when you suddenly have floods of people entering another country, and likely never to leave because, there's so many. And so that raises all sorts of controversies as to, the economy and the culture and everything else. And so, there's a lot of things to think about, in terms of all those particular issues, many of which have nothing to do with UFOs or aliens. It's just it's us as a people, as a race, as a civilization.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there was some kind? I mean, do you think that that the RH issue was a genetic anomaly, or do you think that there might have been extraterrestrial intervention and these are, a pure bloodline, I guess, would be one way to say it?
Yeah, well, I mean, because it's such a controversial issue and it's so old, the way I wrote it is to demonstrate to people that this is a theory, and what I've done with the book is to examine the theory and then look for data that may be out there to support it, rather than me dogmatically saying that, the RH negatives definitely have a UFO link. I don't, it's not written like that. It's written from the perspective of, are they? And if they are, well, let's look at what the data suggests and can we make connections? So, we can make a case can be made that it was like a natural mutation. But then the problem is we have to explain how and why it was a spontaneous natural mutation. That's one of the important things to remember. Now, one of the sort of prevailing theories, and granted it's a controversial one, as I point out in the book, it's derived from interpretation and translation of ancient texts, relates to the story of the Anunnaki. A lot of people have heard of the Anunnaki, but, a lot of stuff gets said about them. A lot of people don't really know, the background as to. Essentially, they were sort of, again, depending on whose version of the interpretation and translation you accept, but either gods or higher supernatural entities or aliens that were very much part and parcel of the people of ancient Babylonia and the Assyrians, and who came down to the earth, and in the same way, like so many other ancient religious texts, where you have these higher beings coming down and helping humanity or changing them, or the gods coming down and taking human wives, and then the birth of the Nephilim and the men of renown, as they were known. In other words, the whole idea of some sort of intervention by higher beings that altered and manipulated the human race. And so that's one of the angles I talk about in the book. Could some of these legends of things like the Anunnaki and Quetzalcoatl in Middle America, things like that, could they actually be distortions of early extraterrestrial, not just visitation, but intervention as well, to create something or alter something? I mean, if you look at as I point out in the book, if you look at the biblical story of Adam, Adam's rib, well, supposedly was used to create Eve. Now, if people ask me, do I believe that? Well, I don't personally believe that, a guy with a long robe and a beard pulled out Adam's rib, waved his hand, and Eve was created. That's nonsense. It's impossible. But if you read, the biblical translation, what it actually says is that God placed Adam into a great sleep and removed his rib, and then it was used to create Eve. Well, placing Adam or whoever or whatever into a great sleep sounds like some higher entity anesthetizing the person. The removal, now in the ancient texts, pre-English translation, the rib, in the old Hebrew text, the rib was actually the same word for the side. So in other words, it may not necessarily be the rib itself. It may be a portion of the side of the body, in which case it could have been skin, it could have been cells, which we start then getting into issues like genetics and DNA. We're doing things like this today, cloning, DNA, gene splicing. It sounds very much to me that, like I said, Adam may have been, sort of a catch-all term for early humans. We don't really know. But it could be the case that, as I said, the great sleep was placed under anesthetic, materials were removed to, gene splice and upgrade a species. You can, I know there may be some people listening who are very religious and may think what I'm saying is outrageous, but you can easily interpret it like that. And as I said in the book, I'm not saying that's the correct answer. I'm saying that you can interpret it that way just as easily as you can interpret it from the perspective of like a deity with supernatural powers. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. Hey, I've written a book on that. Everyone should buy it. No.
So, it is controversial. Anything when you get into religion and reinterpreting text and things like this, it creates a lot of controversy, and I get that. And as I point out in the introduction, the book isn't anti-religion. What it's doing is demonstrating an alternative scenario, and if people, the way I look at it, if people are so caught up in things, they can't even accept looking at a different scenario. There's something wrong, We're talking about ancient manuscripts, reinterpreted, translated who knows how many times, and we know that certain portions of the original Bible actually didn't make it to latter-day Bibles. Material was censored and pulled, largely for political reasons more than anything else. So, it's important we remember all this.
Mm-hmm. What was I going to say? So we have these people with these Rh negative blood, and I've heard connections of individuals like that and you kind of made this connotation, are attracted to UFOs. I've also heard that, that a lot of people that have had abduction experiences also have been identified with having Rh negative blood. Do you think it could, and this is conjecture, that it could be some kind of like a marker kind of thing to make it more easy to find them?
It may well be that there could be something in the blood, that is identifiable. I mean, there are certain patterns that actually do suggest that. I mean, I'll give you a few classic examples. Now, every year, I mean, a small percentage of the human population was born with an extra vertebra in the back. Now, most people would not even know about it, unless they had back surgery. And even if they did, the doctor might not even bother telling them, oh, you've got an extra vertebra. But it's a natural condition where, every year so many people are born with an extra vertebra. But in Rh negatives, the percentage is actually higher than in the rest of the population. If you're Rh negative, you actually have a higher chance than everybody else of having an extra vertebra. Now, what's interesting is if we go back to what is arguably the most famous alien abduction of all, the Betty and Barney Hill case of 1961, the Hills were coming back from a holiday in Canada, driving back home late at night to their home in New Hampshire, and saw this light in the sky, which at first they thought was a star or a planet, began to move, got closer, and then they saw it was like some sort of vehicle, saw entities inside, and then it all starts to get a little bit sort of vague and, missing time and strange dreams and nightmares in the weeks and days afterwards, to the point where the Hills eventually had regressive hypnosis to try and figure out what on earth happened in this missing couple of hours. Now, what's interesting, bearing in mind this issue of the extra vertebra, when Barney Hill was hypnotized, he said that the aliens were running their fingers up and down his spine, and with hindsight, he felt that they were counting his vertebra. Now, this was like, the experience occurred in 61. The hypnosis was sort of 62, 63, 64, and John Fuller's book, The Interrupted Journey, was published in 66. So we're talking more than 50 years ago when Barney Hill said this about them running the fingers up and down his spine. And yet that ties in today with what we hear. Now, certainly nobody was talking 50 years ago other than Barney Hill, and even he wasn't making a connection. He just thought it was odd. But, we're actually seeing something more than 50 years ago that ties in with what people are saying today about extra vertebra, abductions, and Rh negative blood. Another example, I said it's not just abductees and contactees, but it's people who just feel drawn to the subject, fascinated by it. And bear in mind this story, relates to the whole angle of ancient aliens. One of the most profound things is that a number of significant people within the ancient astronaut research community are Rh negative. The world's most famous proponents of the ancient astronauts theory, Eric von Daniken, is Rh negative. Brad Steiger, who's extensively written about ancient mysteries like Atlantis, the pyramids, vanished civilizations. Brad is Rh negative, as is almost all of his family. The late Robert Anton Wilson, who was heavily interested in Egyptian stories of links to ancient aliens, he was Rh negative. And there's a number of other ones as well. So in that sense, we're seeing like a pattern developing there where it's, as I said, it's not just people who've had the experiences, but people who feel there's something almost like encoded in them that draws them to the subject, but they're not really sure why. It's sort of on the tip of the tongue, or when you have a dream and it starts to fade from your mind when you wake up. You remember you dreamt something, but it starts to fade from your memory. And it's kind of like that with the Rh negatives. It's almost they know there's something about the UFO subject that draws them to it, but they just cannot pinpoint what it is beyond having to research it and dig into it more.
But see, I think that's interesting. One of the things that I've noticed is people that are psychics, ones that I think are credible, like me and some of my friends. We're all dyslexic. All of us, the whole lot of us can't spell, have no phonics skills. It gets kind of embarrassing. But I'll ask people, or they'll make some comment and I'll be like, "Are you dyslexic?" And they're like, "Yes." But they're all psychic people. And I think that's interesting, that there's this genetic thing, there's with people that, use their intuition or are, very kinesthetic, that there is a processing issue so that they're able to process on other levels than other people. Anyway.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that, because you can find that in several areas. I mean, like people who have like Asperger's syndrome, I mean, that can cause sort of, certain sort of social issues. But also, people who have Asperger's, they're very often extremely good artists, or, they have a really deep understanding of mathematics and, in way, incredibly good at sort of calculating figures. What's 57,000 multiplied by 326 or something like that. They can pull this out of their mind. So in other words, there are certain situations and conditions where, we shouldn't view, we shouldn't view it as like a handicap. We should view it that these people are sort of unique, and in their own way, that they have unique properties and skills that the rest of us actually don't have.
Okay, so we've talked about kind of this ancient alien connection, kind of bringing it a little more into present time. But one of my burning questions is, do we find Rh negative factors in the royalty, in our political leaders? If you think about it, the pharaohs were considered the gods, the god on earth, and many kings are considered god on earth. Do we find that they also have this Rh thing going on, Rh negative going on in their blood?
Yeah, we actually do. I mean, that's an interesting thing. I mean, the British royal family is primarily, all negative. And you find that in also in a number of U.S. presidents and people who've sort of, in many respects, altered world history as well. I mean, for example, perhaps the royals are the most famous of the negatives. The most infamous is probably Lee Harvey Oswald, who allegedly shot President Kennedy. It just so happens that his wife, Marina, she was, well, still is, Rh negative as well. And so, you do find this, and I actually talk about this in the book, the idea that if visiting extraterrestrials in the distant past manipulated an early human to create or turn it into an Rh negative, and I explain why they might do that in a bit, because there's sort of certain health-related issues that actually, where you can benefit from being Rh negative. But just before I get to that, the idea that, if visiting extraterrestrials did manipulate the human race in the distant past, and then let's say they left, or they certainly scaled down, to the point where it's more stealthy today with abductions, they might want to leave some sort of remnant or, message or, aspect of themselves behind. So, in other words, whereas perhaps 50, 60,000 years ago they were the rulers of the planet, they're clearly not today, but perhaps in a strange way, by ensuring that the Rh negatives hold high places in office, etc., maybe they perceive that as being like ruling by proxy, you know what I mean? They're not literally ruling, but it is like a by proxy ruling of the planet. And in a strange way, they're still, the Rh negatives, which the Anunnaki themselves may well have been, they're still in a strange way pulling the strings of the planet, even if it's not directly.
Well, it just makes me wonder, and we'll use the royals for example, if they are not abductees and the extraterrestrials are like mind controlling them to come down here to like do certain things.
Well, I've never sort of really touched upon that, but I mean, there's no. I mean, for example, we know Prince Charles was heavily interested in crop circles. Extremely interested in it. Prince Philip, his father, married to Queen Elizabeth. Prince Philip used to subscribe to Flying Saucer Review magazine. He may well still do so. I'm not even sure if it's still going now or not, but I mean, certainly from the 50s onwards, and he was very interested in the story of George Adamski and the contactees. There's actually a guy named Sir Peter Horsley who was a senior member of the British military, and Prince Philip actually asked him to sort of find out as much for him as he could about the UFO subject. And, so in that sense, we've got things like that. And so Prince Charles fascinated by crop circles. You have to wonder, is all this purely coincidence and nothing else at all? And, of course, there is the fact that the royal family is very keen to ensure that it doesn't sort of really go outside of the confines of, the royals themselves. I mean, not to the point where it's all totally inbred or anything like that. But I mean, they are careful and, about who gets married to who and try and figure out, the best person for this person, et cetera, et cetera. And, you can make a case that it's actually been done deliberately. I mean, that's one of the reasons why there was such an uproar, not with the general public. The public in England couldn't have cared less, but for the royals, they were very concerned when Diana started to see Dodi Fayed, purely and simply because, they were worried about the sort of, the British royal family suddenly has, somebody from a totally different culture, religion and background actually, potentially, if it had happened, marrying the woman who gave birth to the next King of England, Prince William, when he finally becomes king. So, the royals were extremely against the whole Diana and Dodi Fayed thing.
I just think it's interesting that the royals are interested in UFO stuff because they don't know the truth. And it just tells you at what level still, in a different country, there's this separation between, I'm going to say, the military intelligence and the ruling people.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if this scenario, is all 100% vindicated or, real, but we just haven't proved it. What I think is that, the average people said to me, should we fear the RH negatives, as if it's like they're all going to rise up like the Walking Dead, and attack everybody else. It's not like that at all. I mean, the average person who hasn't never had their blood group checked won't even know they're RH negative. It's not like all the RH negatives having secret phone calls with each other at 3 a.m. We're all the same, and there's no, nothing sinister going on. But what I do think is that there could be people within some of these powerful ancient families, secret societies, the real power brokers on the planet who really run things. I think they may at least have a fair degree of, if not understanding, of suspicion that this ancient bloodline, the RH negative bloodline, needs to be preserved. And I think they've sort of come to believe and accept that these ancient texts do suggest genetic manipulation, and they see themselves as the RH negatives as something that has to be continued. And from their perspective, they are the elite. But from the respect of all the other millions of RH negatives on the planet, they're just everyday people because they haven't been exposed to the issue of why it's important, that kind of thing, you see. But I mean, there's certain other issues where this ties in, I have sort of substantial sections in the book on like hybrid children and hybrid babies today and the black-eyed children and things like that because, I point out that in the distant past, if and when all this went on, we clearly would have been dealing with like a massive extraterrestrial Anunnaki presence, pretty much, overseeing the planet 40, 50,000 years ago and using us potentially as a slave race. That's sort of the prevailing theory in ancient astronaut quarters, if you like, that, they created us, or a particular type of human, as a slave race. But we're obviously not seeing that today, because the only sort of genetic stuff we see going on is abductions. And I kind of wonder if the tables have turned a bit, in the sense that, yes, maybe in the very distant past, 45, 50,000 years ago, we were, a test subject, and we were, under their iron fist. But if we look at abduction stories today, it's almost like the other way around, that they use us for genetic materials, essentially to help themselves. So I wonder if in that since, when they were the masters of the planet to today, something went wrong and they went on an evolutionary decline. And now they use us not as a slave race. Ironically, the tables have turned to where they use us to stay alive. They sort of reap us of genetic materials. And that may explain what I just mentioned, like the hybrid babies and hybrid children that people talk about seeing in abduction cases. They're trying to create a crossbred species, possibly, to ensure their survival, because...
But where does that notion come from, to ensure their survival?
Well, I mean, the only reason we have that is because of the fact that, you can look at different scenarios, but it's sort of, again, a theory. The idea that if we speak to these abductees, if you go back sort of in the 60s and 70s, yes, we had abduction stories, but it was sort of missing time, people were taken on board a craft. And even with the Betty and Barney Hill case, there was a vague sort of undercurrent of like a sexual angle to it, but it wasn't explicitly open. And that continued through the 70s, and it was really only in the 80s onwards that things changed, and it became more sexual, reproductive-based, genetics, DNA, egg, sperm, that kind of thing. Then in the 90s was when people started talking about these hybrid children being, abductees would say they're on a craft or they're in some underground installation, and the so-called Greys would present the abductees with these weird-looking, half-human, half-alien-looking babies and children, encourage them to play with them and interact with them as if the Greys couldn't do it themselves. And so this, regardless of whether it's true or not, it did create the theory that the Greys can no longer reproduce on their own anymore, and so they have to integrate something else into their species to try and essentially stay alive. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know. But, it is a fact that we didn't really have hybrid babies and hybrid children stories back in the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. It's like this is a new component in the last 25 years or so, as if, the program, if you like, if that's what it is, has been sent to a new level. And one of the interesting things is that something that's been speculated and based around how the Greys look is that they may have something similar to a condition here on Earth, which is called progeria. Now, progeria is, in simple terms, it's actually known as the aging disease. It unfortunately usually affects, almost exclusively affects children, to where they age extremely rapidly, and, they're sort of dead usually, unfortunately, like 15, 16, I think, 20, and I think there's a couple that may have made it to 30, but, they age very quickly. Their skin looks very withered, lined, and leathery. They lack hair. They're very thin. Their heads are oversized, and, and a lot of genetic anomalies, unfortunately, that, take their lives early. And if you Google, like, the Greys plus progeria, you'll find a number of articles where people have suggested the Greys may have some sort of inherent widespread condition like progeria, and they need to dilute their race to beef it up, essentially, with our race. And again, it's a theory, but, who knows? But it's an intriguing theory nonetheless.
All right. We just got a question from the chat room. I have another question, so we are going to come back to both after the break. How's that, Nick?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. We're here talking to Nick Redfern. What we've been talking about is his new book, Bloodline of the Gods. We're also going to be talking about his other book, Secret History, Conspiracies from Ancient Aliens to New World Orders. And we'll be back after these words from our sponsors.
Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages. And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello, and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and we're here talking to Nick Redfern about his books, Bloodline of the Gods and Secret Histories, Conspiracies from Ancient Aliens to the New World Order. His webpage is nickredfern40n.blogspot.com. And this hour of Just Energy Radio is brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com, where you can jumpstart your intuition today by downloading their free 50-page guide. Nick, before we went to break, we were talking about hybrids and royalty, and we have a question from Neutron in the chat room, and I'm trying to focus here. And he says, Nick, would you then support Dr. David Jacobs? Do you know who David Jacobs is?
Yeah.
Okay. His new book that says in abductions, we are now past the hybrid stage and hybrids are being crossbred one more time to create hybrids.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting angle because one of the other things we're sort of seeing more and more of in more recent years is, this issue of not just seeing these hybrid babies and children in very often like underground installations and things like this, but actually on the streets. There's more and more reports surfacing where people have said, and often abductees, that they've seen people following them on the streets. That feeling that you get when someone's watching you, you turn around and somebody is watching you, everybody has that. But, there's a few cases where like, abductees in particular have been followed by somebody who, got like a long coat on and a fedora hat or, woolly hat, sunglasses, collar and scarf, so you really don't get to see much of the face. And when the person actually gets close to them, they actually look really weird, like no lines or pores on the skin, and they can see behind the sunglasses there's actually sort of large bulging eyes. It's almost like they're walking amongst us to see how successfully they can integrate themselves, on the average city street or whatever, which sounds bizarre, but there are so many stories like that. And in many respects, there's actually an early precedent to this which still goes on, which is the mystery of the Men in Black. As I mentioned earlier, I've done 3 books on the Men in Black. And if you read the real stories, not the movie versions like Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, where they're like secret agents, most of the real Men in Black are sort of described as only sort of 5 feet to 5 feet 5 tall, very pale, blank looking, no lines on the faces, like they've been Botoxed to the, to the eyeballs. And they look strange, and we see more of that, reports like that, of these sort of very closely looking human type entities, but when you get close to them and you sort of see through the camouflage, etc., they may not actually be human at all. And it's like David Jacobs suggests, that this is not, he views it as an infiltration, and when I say infiltration, he means it from like a really deep and sinister perspective, that they're worming their way into society more and more, influencing us and possibly, one day looking for control. And right now, they may be at the stage of sort of testing the waters, and I said wandering around and being seen and just gauging how many people actually notice them. And of course, in today's world, half the people are walking around with their head down looking at their iPhone anyway, so they might not even notice an elephant walking past, never mind an alien,
Mm-hmm. All right, so this is my question on it, because you said that it was a theory about that they're trying to take care of themselves. But based on the historical evidence that they came and did this genetic thing with the life forms on the earth, couldn't it be just as valid a theory that they're here to create humans 3.0 and facilitate our evolution.
Yeah, I mean, it may be. It's like several things. It may not just be, a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, it's kind of if we look at their relationship to us, if you look at our relationship to animals, if you think about it, we have an odd relationship with animals. We love our cats and dogs, but we never think twice about eating a pig or a cow. And so we our minds, we're not focused on, for example, you're looking at an animal from this perspective or that. We make we make choices and decisions how we treat animals, different animals, based on different circumstances and what the animal is. So it could be, and that's unfortunate if we all think about it. We don't like to think about things like that, but at the end of the day, millions of people queue up to buy a steak, but they take great care of their little dog, that kind of thing. So it could be a similar thing, that there's multiple reasons why they're here and they may want to make use of us. They may feel that we're a resource to them as well, but they also may not view us as a threat, and they may legitimately want to upgrade us. I mean, if they do need our genetics, then arguably they would want to upgrade us because they would want us to stay alive and not destroy ourselves, because if we destroy ourselves, their resource is gone. Their genetic resource is gone. So the last thing they would probably want was for us to, start pressing the red button and the missiles are flying. So in that sense, they perhaps would want to create a more sort of, a planet-oriented human rather than, we're the Russians and you're the Chinese or whatever.
Well, and that would be, I don't know, that's just speculation on my part, because I feel like we have the precedents and it would kind of make sense to what's going on, because it doesn't seem evident that they're trying to take over our planet.
Well, no, I actually agree with that. There's no evidence I've seen that there's anything like Independence Day or War of the Worlds, nothing like that. We're not seeing that at all. So whatever's going on, it's going on in the background, and you can look at it from two ways. One is in the background, bit by bit, they're trying to upgrade us from a positive perspective, and at the same time, they also realize that they can gain something from us because of possibly genetic degradation on their part, that they're sort of on a slide down. So in that sense, there's no need for them to invade. They just hope and pray that we don't blow ourselves up, because then their resources gone. Now, on the other hand, the invasion, when we think of a UFO invasion, we're automatically, I think, primed to think of like the Hollywood-style invasion. Like I said, with Independence Day and huge craft in the skies and, cities being destroyed and things like that. Well, the whole David Jacobs angle, in many respects, is even more sinister. We're not talking about craft in the skies where the military could gauge if they could take them on and, all the countries come together and try and fight them. What we're talking about is something we don't even know or realize, that it's sort of slowly and subtly working its way into society bit by bit and infiltrating us and getting into here and getting into there. And before we know it, it's like the invasion's over before it began. I think, if alien invasion ever did happen, it wouldn't be like in the movies where, we manage at the last minute to beat them and everything's cool, I think it would be over before we knew it. It would be something like the unleashing of like a specifically designed virus to sort of wipe out people, release the aerosol all across, in an aerosol basis across the planet. Within a month, potentially you could have wiped everybody out on the planet. There would be no need to destroy cities and things like that. I mean, that's great for movies, it makes for good visuals, but I'm sure a highly advanced extraterrestrial race, it could be over overnight. We wouldn't even see it coming.
At this point in time, I mean, thousands of years ago, they definitely had the technology jump on us. At this point in time, do you think that we are closing the gap technologically from these
Well,
extraterrestrials?
I actually do, and I think for two reasons. One, because our technology is developing, and also, if they are, to a degree, on an evolutionary decline, they may be slightly becoming more and more impoverished as time goes on. Maybe the reason why there's so many UFO reports here, people say, well, if these are aliens, why there's so many reports? Surely they can't be coming back and forth, etc. Well, maybe they're not. Maybe they are in an impoverished state where they're now forced to stay here. Perhaps they don't have the resources to even leave the planet anymore. But maybe I sometimes wonder if some of these UFO events, they seem to have like a staged quality to them, as if the person was meant to see and have the encounter. And I wonder if they do that deliberately to try and instill a belief on our part that they're extremely all-powerful. But maybe it's sort of like a ruse to get that imagery across. Perhaps their numbers are actually limited and the craft are limited, but they try and make it seem more than that. And so, yeah, I do wonder if, our technology is increasing. There's maybe at a standstill because they're sort of almost in like a holding stage, while they try and preserve their species through abductions and genetics. And but I mean, that's going to have a spiraling effect as well as our technology develops, with knowing the difference between what might be a real UFO and like a sophisticated drone or whatever's going to come next. The things we're building now, 50 years ago, people would have said it's a UFO or it's a flying saucer. It isn't. It's just a drone, or it's some weird remotely piloted vehicle of the military. So, yeah, that is becoming more and more difficult today, particularly when we hear about stories like Amazon are going to start using drones and things like that. Although I have to say I'm fairly skeptical that, the idea of, millions of people ordering stuff on Amazon every day, and, you've got millions of drones zipping all around the streets. These blades, spinning at however many, turns a second. I just don't see that happening, really.
Yeah, I don't find that happening either.
No.
But it'll be interesting. I think things are changing so much now that, could you imagine the things that we know now go back 200 years, to that belief system before manned flight, before motion pictures, before everything that we just take for granted now?
Well, yeah, there's certainly been benefits. The internet, who could have predicted the internet? Probably, you could have predicted the internet 30 years ago, but nobody really saw it coming, and how quickly it has changed literally world civilization. A lot of people don't realize that, most people around the planet, not, just advanced nations, most people have iPhones, whatever country you're talking about, the US, the UK, South America, Scandinavia, everybody's got them. And so, the internet has definitely changed everybody's way of life in some good ways, social media-wise, interaction-wise. You can keep in touch with friends who live on the other side of the planet without having to send an airmail letter, take 7 days and 7 days back, But there are obviously ways in which the internet has massively impacted from a negative perspective. One is, the issue of childhood. Kids just sitting at home, texting friends on the bed. To me, being a kid was riding around town on my bike till 8 o'clock, falling off, getting scratched and, on the gravel and everything else, and have to come home and have it all washed off and, climbing trees and all that kind of thing. Well, today, kids don't do that anymore, or at least not to the extent that they used to. Today it's all about, if you go outside at night, you're going to be killed. You're going to be abducted. And you can't. My
sister has a 14-year-old daughter that wanted to walk to the bus stop by herself. It's 2 blocks away, and her mom wouldn't let her walk.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, I get, the fact that the world is more dangerous, but we've been told it's far more dangerous than it actually is. People just, they assume that, well, if you let your kids outside, they're going to die, which is nonsense, I mean, when I was a kid, the world, I was out till 8 o'clock at night. My mum and dad be like, just make sure you're back before the sun's down or the moon's up,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of
the
thing.
street lights come on. That was a
that's right. Come home when the street lights are on. And I'd come back home with bruises and, fell off the bike again. I got like 6-inch long scratches all down your leg. Well, today, if you went to school the next day, the teachers would look at you and they'd have the police round thinking you've been, physically abusing your kids. It's like, no, he fell off his bike. That's what kids are supposed to do. So in other words, that's the downside of the internet. The other side, of course, is the fact of, particularly with kids, what the impact of just staying indoors does from a physical perspective of obesity, the massive rise in the last 10 years in under 10s who are diabetic. If you read the figures, it's like shocking figures. And this is just down to inactivity. That's all it is. So, there are things like this which help society, but handled in the right way can, change society in the future for really good reasons. But, just because our technology is advancing doesn't mean it actually, in the long run, is always a good thing for us. We need to find that balance of where we don't have this kids isolated and whatever. I mean, I'm certainly no psychiatrist or psychologist, but when I see all these kids being put on pills and medications for depression or anxiety or this or that, when they're like 10 years old, well, to me, it's part of it isn't because of somebody creates a new syndrome. You've got BFGHX syndrome. No, you haven't. I think a lot of it is just the fact that kids are bored, that they know there's more to life than what they've got, but they don't see it and they don't experience it because they're not allowed to anymore, and so it's like it's like a lion in the zoo pacing back and forth. It's not in its natural environment. It looks like its natural environment, but it isn't. That's why it's pacing back and down and throwing itself at the glass every time somebody walks past, and waves at it or whatever.
Oh, I agree. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff, depression you see a lot in these kids because they don't want to do anything at all. And some of them, you just need to tell them to go outside and play. Go run. Go run up and down the street 25 times and then come back and I'll let you know if you're done.
Yeah, and, but you just don't see that. I don't know why it is. I mean, again, it's like you could have the balance, but it's like things have just swung from one thing to another. And, of course, the other big downside, of course, is when so many people spend their lives on social media, online social media, as we know through, the Edward Snowden revelations, it's far easier to track everybody. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the Secret History book is how, years ago, sort of 10, 15 years ago, there was this entire subculture in conspiracy theorizing that said, there's going to be some sort of national emergency and there's going to be a law passed where everybody's going to have a tracking device implanted in them. Well, that won't happen. And people say, well, of course it will. I say it won't because everybody's already implanted with a tracking device. It's called an iPhone. People don't go anywhere without their iPhone. It doesn't matter if it's not inserted under the skin, providing they've got that iPhone in their pocket, hooked on the belt or whatever. That can track their every movement. It can track their every social media activity. It can track every email, every Facebook message, every news story that you go to. That's 10 times better than any sort of tracking device under your skin could ever achieve. So it's already the microchipping of the population has already been done. It just hasn't been done with microchips. It's been done in what many people see as a friendly fashion, phones. It's not like a sinister fashion, even though it can be used, or the phone can be exploited in a sinister way.
I'm glad I don't use my phone that much.
Well, I actually don't because, I'm one of these people who, I like to have I do my writing 8 to 5 and I like to have a regular life, and for me, that is stopping at 5 o'clock, and the weekend and nights is like taking a girlfriend out to see a band or going to see a soccer game. Sports is one of my big things, and I'm heavily into soccer, obviously coming from England. So I see a soccer game, go and see a band play, and whatever. I like to do stuff, and that to me, socializing isn't texting. Where are you? If I want to know where you are, I'll call you up and we'll go out and hang out or whatever. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, since you kind of shifted our gears over into the secret history book, let me ask you a question that kind of goes along that line. What do you think is going on in countries like Iraq? And this kind of brings the ancient alien into this whole thing. I've heard people suggest that there might be some ancient technology in those countries, and that some of the conflicts that we're finding in the Middle East, it actually has a darker agenda. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I actually talk about in the book about that in the book, because there is, again, sort of this undercurrent, and it kind of actually brings two groups of people together who you never really would imagine would come together, and that's sort of like the ancient astronauts researchers and the sort of the hardcore conspiracy theorists. But in this one particular issue, they do come together, and they have actually to sort of share data, and it's the idea that I talk about this in the book, and I point out, my personal view is that I don't know, where the truth begins and the rumors end and vice versa. But, that when the Iraq war began and was certainly going on, there were a lot of rumors floating around that at least a portion of the invasion was an attempt to try and access ancient artifacts that may have, had sort of connections to ancient extraterrestrials. And one of the things that constantly crops up in this debate is you probably remember it's like a famous part of the whole war situation, was the looting of the Baghdad Museum. Mm-hmm. Now, the U.S. military, actually, the Army had an independence team, an Army team itself, but it was like, that went in to figure out, where all this material had gone. I mean, literally sort of talking about thousands of artifacts. Now, a lot of them were recovered, but a lot of them weren't. And some of these were priceless, and there were rumors about that the looting of the museum was actually like a cover to camouflage somebody else actually targeting specific artifacts, but make it look like just some sort of anarchy-based looting situation, but, hide the real picture underneath it. And there were a lot of rumors about people looking for technologies that are described like in the ancient texts, like white powder gold and manna from heaven, sort of ancient elixirs that could sort of extend human lifespans and things like that. That was one of the areas a lot of people were focusing on, the idea of a search for whatever it was that allegedly, at least, allowed for some of these ancient religious characters like Noah and Methuselah to live for massive lifespans, And again, it's a highly controversial theory, but the fact is, when the military, when the U.S. military went in there and looked at the whole museum looting situation, there is an actual conclusion in the report that they felt that it was, part of it at least was planned. Certainly there were some bandwagon jumpers who were just looters, but they felt that, the certain portions of the museum where some of the highly valuable artifacts were stored, in parts of the museum that most people wouldn't have known about, they were actually targeted. And the military was pretty sure on that. But whose agenda it was, that's the big question. But I mean, that was and still is actually a big area of research for a lot of people.
Well, and it's interesting because the museum was looted, but they've never, I'm going to say, published images of what was taken. And that they had to have documented it and photographed it. I mean, it is the 20th century. There should have been some kind of record of what was taken. And that just seems to be this little quiet mystery.
Well, yeah, I mean, we do have some of the pictures of some of them, and sort of like, inventories and so on. A lot of them were sort of like ancient statues and, and things like that, pottery, early, creations of the people who lived in that area 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. But as I said, there are rumors of, not so much what they found, but what they were hopefully trying to find and were looking for. And a lot of this, as I said, relates to things like the story of Gilgamesh, suppose again having like an extensive lifespan and looking for sort of these immortality elixirs in what is today Iraq, and according to some actually finding them, that this theory then develops into the idea of trying to create immortality for the elite, and while the rest of us get 80 or 90 years, if we're lucky, that these elixirs would potentially allow for, for all intents and purposes, incredible lifespans. And, it might sound like sci-fi to some people, but, today, even in the regular medical world, there are actually sort of little subsections where they actually are trying to find a way to slow the aging process, to find out and understand fully why it is that our cells and age and degrade. Why does that happen? Why is it that we get like 90 years or 80 years? Why is it that, say, a cat gets 15 years? Parrots can live like 70, 80. Crocodiles can like 120, 130. So in other words, if we could understand why we're on a time limit and we could change that or slow it down, that's what we're talking about. So, it gets into sort of sinister areas when you hear these stories about, the elites wanting to try and grab this sort of technology for themselves while the rest of us, make the most of 80 years or whatever.
But I find that concept interesting because it also implies that the government puts some kind of credence into the ancient narratives that are obviously science fiction and, totally made up by our ancestors.
Well,
Quote,
yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point because, again, sometimes when it comes to what the government, when people say the government, people sometimes think I'm an apologist for the government when I say I actually don't think that, the UFO cover-ups and things like the Kennedy assassination, I actually really, truly don't believe the government is behind any of this. What I believe is that there's like an incredibly powerful but incredibly deeply buried, what we might call like a shadow government, and I think they're probably installed in most of the major powers around the world. And they're the real sort of manipulators of the planet and the real controllers, these deeply buried secret societies, powerful families. And I think these are the ones who are initiating, the quest to find these sort of, the quest for immortality in Iraq. I mean, we have to remember the reason we know that all the, that the museum wasn't just looted, but it was targeted. We know that because it was the U.S. Army that actually did the report and came to that conclusion. So in other words, if it was the military, the U.S. military, they wouldn't be concluding that it was being targeted. They would have said it was all down to just looters. So that's, it's things like this that lead me to believe that the government, as we understand, an elected government, and even probably the regular agencies like the CIA or whoever, I honestly don't think they're the bad guys at all. But there are bad guys, and I think the bad guys are like these, as I said, rogue organizations, black budget programs, as they're called, where they're answerable. Congress doesn't even know they exist. They operate outside the law, but they have tentacles all around the planet, and they're extremely powerful, and they're the ones running the show. And I think they're the ones who know, or at least suspect, the possibility of things like immortality, and so they go looking for it. Yes, it's based on theories and their belief systems, but they go looking. But we then interpret it, well, it's the government doing it, but I actually don't think it is. It's like a government within a government.
Well, and that whole thing just irritates me because if the government knows that these projects are going on, but they're not part of the government, but they know that they're illegal, then why don't they just call them all out
Well, they
and
may
just,
not actually
bring it to the
know.
surface?
Well, they may not even know the full story. I mean, you look at your average presidents. I mean, they're in for 4 years. If they're lucky, they get 8 years. And for most of their time in office, they get data given to them by their advisors. Like a defense advisor, a science advisor, a medical advisor, and they get daily summaries because no one could ever learn every aspect of government. They're reliant on people to tell them, and those people can only tell them what they know. So in other words, if you have an incredibly deeply buried organization with strands across the planet which is heavily researching like ancient artifacts that could have a bearing on science and technology today, and let's say there's a deeply buried group of these people in America, 50 very powerful people that may have links to government but operate, they have like a secret life as well. And then you may have 10 in France, 10 in England, 15 in China. And they're the billionaires, the people with the money, the old families, with powerful ties going back centuries. So in other words, it may be the case that we give governments too much credence in thinking that they have all the answers. They may be, in many respects, as ignorant as we are. I don't mean ignorance in a derogatory term, but I mean in ignorance in terms of not knowing who the big string pullers really are, and not being able to stop it because it's actually outside of, so powerful, it's actually outside of government almost.
I know, but that's the part that just makes it creepy. Maybe it's the extraterrestrials. Well, it just, the more we learn, but the more that we learn and the more these stories come up, it's like, how deep does the rabbit hole go? And are we really living in some kind of a matrix? Because we don't know what the heck is going on our planet, because it's obviously not what we're being told.
Yeah, and I mean, the Matrix thing is an interesting analogy. I don't think we're literally living in a computer simulation, although there are actually a few, interesting books have been written that suggest we actually could be. But, I would make an analogy with like the Matrix in the sense that the world as we see it isn't run the way it's actually run. I'll give you a perfect example. Just a few years ago, sort of about 2001 to 2006, across not just the US but the world, there was a spate of very sinister deaths in the field of microbiology, which is people studying viruses and microbes and diseases, that kind of thing. And I actually have a chapter on this in the Secret History book. But if you Google microbiology scientist deaths, you'll find literally hundreds of people in that field who've died in the last 10 years under very weird circumstances. And, people say it's the CIA taking them out, it's the NSA, whoever. Again, I don't think it is. I think there are powerful figures in the world that have a reason for wiping out some of the significant figures doing viral research, and that may well be because somebody one day may want to unleash some deadly virus, and so they want to get rid of the people who could cure it. And so in that sense, you have to wonder, well, who are the...
That's just plain sick.
Well, Hitler did it. Hitler wiped... How many millions of people did Hitler wipe out because he just didn't like them and he wanted them gone? We hear a lot of stories like this today, but in relation to things like overpopulation, lack of resources, we're always being told to worry about this virus and that virus. It makes you wonder if somebody's planning something. But again, I don't think it's government. I really don't think it's government. I think it's, again, these sort of powerful ancient lineages, the ones who are the elite rulers of the planet. They're the ones who are dictating them. That's why, come back to that, that Matrix analogy, the idea of the world as we see it is not as it really is, and it's not ruled the way it seems to be. It's the decisions are made perhaps in like a really obscure fashion, but goals and achievements are made outside of elected presidential or prime minister decisions. It's done subtly under the table to manipulate people to go down a certain pathway.
It goes right along with the rules that govern society, and I don't mean contemporary laws, but when we think about like the Ten Commandments or the Golden Rule or any of these early structures of law, systems of morality, it's like as a culture we can't live by them. And the more we start hearing this stuff, it seems the more we tell everybody this is how we should live, and we hold up the Ten Commandments. And then if you turn around, there's all of this stuff going on that no way reflects a base of what we were told we're supposed to do. It's like bait and switch.
Well, it's like that old phrase, don't do what I do, do what I say, that kind of thing. And the other one, what's the golden rule? Well, he who's got the gold makes the rule. And yeah, I mean, I really do believe that. I do think, like I said, there's some sort of, powerful order in control of the planet. And I know that might sort of sound outlandish to some people, but I think that is the case. And like I said, we're in our own little environments, people voting, and this is going to change society, and this is going to be a new good 4 years with the next president. But so much I think is the manipulation occurs, to reach outside of that. I mean, it's kind of like just quickly to go back to the whole iPhone thing. You can make a good argument that the government itself may not have gone down the path of the NSA saying, well, we're going to monitor everybody's iPhone. It may well have been that somebody saw one of these powerful groups may have said, well, we can actually make some great capital out of the fact that everybody's got iPhones. We could subtly suggest to people we should start monitoring the iPhones. In other words, it's not a government idea. It perhaps could come from one of these powerful bodies, if you like. And so they achieve their aim, again, sort of like by proxy, by suggesting it, and then before we know it, we're all under surveillance. But the government hasn't come up with the idea. It's been subtly projected to them by maybe somebody in one of these shadow agencies, if you like, or shadow governments that wants the population watched. And so they use the government itself. The government itself doesn't even realize it's being manipulated to do that for somebody else's reasoning.
That's just weird. What do you think about what's going on with kids today? I just heard a story the other day of some high school girl getting pissed off at the security at her school, or had some kind of run-in with the security at her school, and took gasoline to school and doused the security guards with it and tried to light them on fire. I mean, That's pretty bad. But then we have the shootings in the, movie theaters and all of this stuff going on with kids. Do you think there's some kind of mind control going on with them?
Well, I've got to be honest, I don't. I think it's the way society has gone downhill. And part of that, I put that down to the internet changing the natural course of how kids should be, having a good time as kids. And I think another reason is, so many kids are, it's like putting them on drugs, put them on this pill, put them on that medication. I think it's a change in life caused by the internet age. I think it's the fact that so many kids now are on medication. It's like if all this medication was needed for all these millions of kids today, why weren't me and you on it when we were like 10? It's not like we're a different type of species. The reason is because the reason why all those kids are on those medications today is because their parents are told, you need to put them on them because they're shouting and screaming. Well, so what? So what if a kid wants, rebel against the parents? Kids are supposed to rebel against the parents when they're like 10, 12, 13, 14. They're not supposed to be dumbed down to like a bunch of Stepford wives. The natural order is that when you get to that age, when your dad says do this, you say, why should I? I'm coming up to being a man or whatever. That's natural, but we're told that oh, well, your kid screams and shouts a lot, or he's depressed. Well, of course he's depressed. He's just looking at four walls. So I think a lot of what we're seeing today is society is in a bad state, and it's reflected in how society behaves. Fortunately, most of us know it's wrong to commit murder, rob a bank, beat your wife up or whatever. We know, most of us know that, and hopefully most of us don't do any of that, But the fact that we are living in a more violent world does show that people's, they're psychologically, there's sort of like a meltdown going on. And I think the meltdown has multiple reasons. I mean, you could make a mind control scenario out of that, but I think it's probably far more complicated, has more just to do with society and, rules, regulations, I said drugs, the internet, everything. You can roll all this into the mix, and it's like a disaster in the making almost.
Do you think that, like our good friend Jim Morris suggests, they're trying to get rid of us? To thin the surplus population?
Well, I've actually got a section on that in the book as well, on population control. And there's no doubt that studies have been done that recommend that the human population should be vastly lower in number than it is. And now, I guess the big issue is, how is that going to be achieved, if it's going to be achieved? To give you an example, the population now has grown literally billions. Literally like 4 or 5 billion in the last 30 or 40 years. It was, but before then it was like 3 billion. Now it's 7 billion. Figures, people have projected ahead depending on circumstances, of course. It could be sort of 10 billion by 2050, then 15 billion by 2150, then 30 billion by 2400, things like that. That regardless of what happens, if that increase continues, the planet and the resources won't sustain that many people. There will be a collapse. But that's very different from, wiping the population out. We should take steps, I think, to sort of try and look at things for another way, because even I think, overpopulation is going to be a problem, but that doesn't mean, you've got to systematically wipe people out with some designer virus. But you do hear more about this kind of stuff now, about viruses here and viruses there, and a lot of it I think is scaremongering. Everybody remembers swine flu and bird flu and this flu, and then we were all going to die when the Ebola thing happened. Well, what happened? One guy died and the 2 nurses recovered.
Aren't we supposed to have a meteor hit tomorrow?
Well,
Isn't that tomorrow?
Yeah, well, whenever.
Okay, so in case it does, everybody, bye. Nice knowing you. Glad you enjoyed the show.
But
just in
case. A lot of this to me is just. I tell you what, part of it is, and I think what causes it today, is that post 9/11, so many people their mind has gone down their mind is gone into apocalyptic mode. It's like the end times are here. Well.
But it seems like they're programming us with that. We had 9/11, and then we had, Happy Mayan Fool's Day. Then we had more end of the world. The world ended, I don't know how many times in the last 15 years.
Yeah, you can see all these shows on TV like Life After People and, disaster things. And then you had all the movies coming out as much as I love zombie movies, you had a flood of zombie movies, 28 Days Later, Dawn of the Dead, World War Z. They're all about the collapse of the planet. Then you had other types of movies like Knowing or 2012 and Armageddon. These kind of, well, not actually, that was pre, but things like that. And then TV shows, about the end of the world and things like that. And society has become locked in to a degree in that apocalyptic mode that the end's coming. Well, no, the end isn't coming. We've had disasters and terrible wars for as long as people have been around. With 1914 to 1918, we had the First World War. Millions died. Then in 1919, we had Spanish flu, which wiped out, I think, 30 million people across the planet. We had the Second World War that raged from 1939 to 45, killed millions. And what we're seeing today is terrible, yes, but humankind has been like this for years. Viruses, wars, viruses, wars. You go back to like the Middle Ages, the Black Death, which wiped out nearly all of Europe. Things like was it the San Francisco earthquake at the turn of the 20th century? Things like this. And you see this everywhere. People have short memories, so they think, we've got this going on today, we've got that going on. It's the end time. The shootings everywhere. There's viruses. The weather's changing. It's the end times. We've had, you could interpret countless things over the last few hundred years as the end times, but it wasn't. But the difference is today, there are people who want us to live in that state of fear. In the past, you dealt with it and tried to combat it. Now it's like you force-fed it,
All right, so I'm going to throw a question at you, and I'm not sure what your answer is going to be, but it's a little on the metaphysical side. But based on everything that we see going on, do you think we're creating our own reality? Our own doomsday mentality is making it so that we just continue in a downward spiral?
Well, yeah, I actually do, and I'll tell you why I think that. I mean, it's partly metaphysical, but partly also a physical thing, and that is, if you have a negative mindset on things, before we get to the metaphysical, if you have a negative mindset, it's proved that people who are pessimistic, who don't laugh, who don't have a good time, who don't live their life, have shorter lives. People who have pets have lower blood pressure than people who don't have pets. That's a proven fact. And I think with the metaphysical angle, I honestly do believe, because although a lot of what I write about is like nuts and bolts stuff, I actually do think there's like a metaphysical sort of supernatural side to life as well. And I do honestly believe that if you have sort of a negative vibe, it almost creates like an air of negative, like a negative energy latches onto you. And I think if that does happen, which I think it does, and it affects millions of people, it creates like almost like a negative energy sweeping across civilization. And when that starts to happen, it almost is like, in a strange fashion, like the zombie virus taking over. We're waking up, I won't say every day, thank goodness, but we're waking up every other week to mass shootings and just mindless killings, and over-the-top violence. And I do think there is something to the idea of negativity breeds a kind of paranormal negativity, and it gets stronger and stronger as people become more and more locked down in this negative mode, that everything's suddenly going wrong and we're never going to get out of it and everything's going to collapse. And of course the problem is, the bigger it gets, the harder it gets to take it away. It's like somebody who's got, a brain tumor. They put off going to the doctors because their head's throbbing. The more they put it off, the worse it gets. And it's kind of the same thing. If you don't get out of that mode, it just gets worse and worse. So I do think there's something to the idea that the psyche of the human race as a collective body of people can actually impact on the thought processes and the mindset of everybody else. It's almost like you could be influenced. If there's 50 negative people around you, that negative energy could actually infect you in the same way like you get bitten by a zombie in the movies. It infects you in the same way, and more people then become a victim of it. And, tempers get more and more frayed. There's, wild and, over-the-top, violence and things like this, and just out of the blue. And I don't think it's coincidence. It is like there's a pattern developing,
Well, and it just makes me go, okay, and we have these people that are in control, that are doing these things to control and manipulate what's going on. Is this what they were trying to create? A society where there's no hope and there's no food and there's no water and the air, you can't breathe the air.
Well, the thing is, the important thing is, if you create a society which starts to fragment and collapse, that gives you then a reason or an excuse to move in and control it with more and more regulations and rules and emergency powers. If everything's cool and everything's running fine, you're not in control because you have no justification for demanding that you have to have control. In other words, if you manufacture a situation where people are driven to feel everything's going to hell, and there's no hope, and this, etc., etc., and people start rising up and complaining, and demonstrating, then it becomes like, well, we have to bring in a new law because we can't have you demonstrating, and that leads to another law and another law. So in other words, it could be some of this, as I said, again, I don't think actually it's the government. If you have like a secret group that wants people under control, well, you could, and let's say part of some of these people are responsible for the main media networks and entertainment. They're not part of the government, but they may want to try and influence the government by putting out all these apocalyptic shows, TV shows, movies, secretly funding them, and then people get in this mindset, and then bad things start to happen, and then the government is forced to make a move to introduce new laws. But had this secret group not been doing that, the government wouldn't have had to introduce these laws. So the government actually is as much a victim as we are, because it could well be, like I said, these power manipulators that the government is unknowingly forced to do this because you have these other figures essentially making them make their move.
It makes my head spin.
But I think the one light at the end of the tunnel is that it's like we go back to what I talked about the kids, and not having social lives like we did. Right now, at least, and hopefully it'll continue, nobody's forcing, kids not to play outside or to interact like we do. No one's forcing people to watch TV shows about apocalyptic events or worry about this. If we all said, no, we want to do our own thing, and we're going to take our kids camping and do all this, and we're going to buy them a bike, and we're all going to ride around town and whatever. There's no reason people can't do that. It's not like the jackbooted troops at the door saying you won't take your kids out and play with them and do stuff. People choose not to do it. So people could choose also to have, lives like we did before and do things and, not live in states of fear, but just, we all lived in, well, not all of us, but people who were, of a certain age. I remember when I was like 17, and this was when the Cold War, just before the Berlin Wall came down, and every day we lived under the threat of nuclear attack. But back then, people didn't live like they do today, like in fear. You just thought, well, let's hope it doesn't happen, and you enjoyed your life. But today, people do dwell on it. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big difference. Instead of dwelling on some virus is going to wipe us out, or dwell on as your kid got this or that disease, you just said, no, they haven't. It's not going to happen. And if it does happen,
move on.
Yeah, and if it's going to happen, if a meteorite's going to hit the planet or there's going to be a big viral outbreak, if it happens, I'll deal with it when it happens, because I can't do much about it until it does. In the same way you couldn't do much about it if the Russians pressed the red button. But in the meantime, have a good time. But that's not what's happening. It's like people are in a meltdown of where they just worry about it constantly rather than...
We need to wrap. I'm getting the...
You get the shepherd's crook.
Yes, I am. Nick, thanks for coming on.
All right, thanks, Rita.
All right, bye, Nick. That's Nick Redfern. His books are Bloodline of the God and Secret History, Conspiracies from Ancient Aliens to New World Order. And then next week, we are going to be talking about the forbidden knowledge of Enoch with R.J. von Bruning and the destruction of a free and open society with Eldon Taylor. So till next time, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Week at this time for Just Energy.